Hi everyone, and welcome to the Queering Authoritarianisms conference. It is such a pleasure to be welcoming you all to the opening keynote conversation between Dr. Rahul Rao and Professor Jasbir Puar, which will be chaired by Professor Sarah Franklin. My name is Hakan Sandal Wilson, pronouns he, him, and together with my colleague Marcin Smetana, I am one of the organizers of the conference. I don't want to take up too much time, but I did just want to take a few moments to acknowledge the support which has made this conference possible before I pass over to Marcin. First and foremost, we would like to thank the two sponsors of the conference, LGBTQ+ at CHEM and the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, both at the University of Cambridge. They have been enormously supportive, and we want in particular to thank Nikki Davidovsky from CRASSH, who has been really patient with us. We also want to thank Lena Moore from the Center for Gender Studies at the University of Cambridge and Dr. Matthew Waits from the University of Glasgow, who have both also been an important source of support to us. Finally, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us. I believe the conversations that we'll be having across this week are of great importance, both academically and politically. As we discuss the politics of conflict and resistance, we will surely be left with many questions. Such conversations and the questions they generate are vital, I believe, in forging solidarities within and beyond academia in the face of growing authoritarianisms. So I really do want to thank you all for joining us and for thinking with us around these important issues. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Marcin Smetana.
Thank you. So I would like to welcome everyone warmly as well to Queering Authoritarianisms. And let me just mention how the idea for this conference was born. So one day in 2019, when we could still meet in person, after a talk that Professor Dibyesh Anand gave at the wonderful seminar series, Methods in Question, organized by Hakan Sandal Wilson at Cambridge University, we were talking about how certain narratives about queer politics and authoritarianism overlap in the UK, India, Turkey, and Poland. And that's how the idea for this conference emerged. So thank you for joining this conversation. We are very much looking forward to learning from each other throughout this week. Now, I would like to hand over to Professor Sarah Franklin, who is going to chair today's event. She's a professor of sociology at Cambridge University and the director of LGBTQ+ at CAM, who is co-sponsoring this conference alongside CRASSH. Over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Marcin and Hakan, and welcome everybody. It's such a privilege to be part of this event. It's an incredibly timely topic, and I know from having watched Marcin and Hakan curate this amazing conference over the past year, what a very, very special amount of thought and planning and time and love has gone into making this very beautiful conference. So congratulations. I'm very pleased also to be able to co-sponsor this conference with CRASSH. This is one of a number of events co-sponsored by Q+, the LGBTQ+ research program at Cambridge, and CRASSH. It's been a very, very powerful connection, and I look forward to many more events co-sponsored in this way. Q+, the LGBTQ program at Cambridge, began in January 2018 as a new research initiative funded by the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, which is one of the 6 schools here at Cambridge, beginning in the Department of Sociology, but gradually radiating out to colleagues across the university. Q+ has become a vibrant part of the Cambridge research environment, home to over 200 researchers at all levels, from undergraduate and postgraduate to postdocs, professors, and PIs. Next month, Q+ will be hosting a 4-day event to celebrate the work done in this initiative since our launch in 2018. This will be keynoted by the Black queer filmmaker Campbell X, starting on Monday, the 26th of April, and we'll be sending you more information about that conference during this one. This event, the next one, will be focused on the longstanding effort to transform the university to grow and nurture accessible queer spaces in a new, more porous and outward-looking version of the academy in which critical, intersectional, decolonial, anti-racist, and transformational thinking and teaching can thrive. To me, this event epitomizes all of those objectives. This extraordinary event, curated by Martin and Hakan, embodies so many of the changes that we need to see within the academy and outside of it, including their inspired choice of keynote speakers. Today, we welcome two of the most influential and widely celebrated theorists of queer politics, coloniality, and authoritarianism, Rahul Rao and Jasbir Puar, in our keynote session. It's hard to match this pairing in terms of influence in changing the very meaning of the political, but this conference is a perfect match to their contributions, and consequently, this is a very special event that we're starting today. In the midst of what has been widely viewed as a remarkable, if uneven, global transformation in attitudes toward homosexuality since the turn of the millennium, both our speakers today have raised difficult and troubling questions about the new role of gay liberation as a kind of global index of progress and humanity. Paying attention not only to the gap between radical queer and trans struggles for liberation and corporate gay pride badges, but also to the use of gay pride itself as a form of imperial drag, whereby familiar colonial scripts parade in new clothes, both our speakers at today's event have challenged us to rethink the cultural as well as the political and the global as well as the local. They have also pointed to the very distinctive perils of gay progressivism, of whatever stripe or vintage, when it is weaponized by authoritarian populist wannabes reading from the new playbook in which gay progressivism and gender ideology are used to spread fear and loathing about a new Western NGO and corporate branded lavender menace. This conference comes at an urgent time for thinking through these questions, and I'm very grateful to both of our keynote speakers for joining us today. Rahul Rao, as many of you know, is the author of Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, 2020, and Third World Protests Between Home and the World, both published by Oxford University Press. He's currently writing a book on the politics of controversial statues, which looks brilliant. He's a member of the Radical Philosophy Collective and blogs at the Disorder of Things, among other locations. His research interests are in international relations, post-colonial and queer theory, gender and sexuality, and South Asia. And Rahul is based in the Department of Politics and International Studies at SOAS. The title of his talk today will be, What is the Relationship Between Homonationalism and Homocapitalism? I can't wait. Jasbir Puar is Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. She's the author of the award-winning book Terrorist Assemblages, Homonationalism in Queer Times, 2007, and her most recent book, The Right to Maim, Debility, Capacity, and Disability, is also published by Duke University Press. Currently, Jasbir is completing her third book, a collection of essays on duration, pace, mobility, and acceleration in Palestine, entitled Slow Life, Settler Colonialism, in 5 parts. So following Rahul's talk, we'll move directly into discussion from Jasbir and between Jasbir and Rahul before the Q&A. So without any further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Rahul for his opening talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that lovely, generous introduction. Thanks to Hakan and Marcin for organizing this. I'm in complete awe of people who are able to organize complex events like this under the circumstances in which we're all currently living. So an especially big congratulations to you for bringing us together to talk about these important issues around queering authoritarianisms. And thanks to CRASSH, to Nikki, and to Q+, Sarah, for bringing us here. I also have to say a really big thank you to Jasbir in many different capacities. Anyone who's read anything I've written will know how deep my intellectual debts are to Jasbir, and I think that will become evident over the course of the conversation this evening as well. Jasbir has been a mentor, a friend, academic godmother, all kinds of things. So it's really, it's wonderful to be having this conversation with you, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. I want to just start by picking up something in the conference blurb, which I think maybe gives us a mandate, something to think about as we move into the next few days. And this is, and I'm quoting here, while racial, ethnic, and religious identity formations and mobilizations are readily apparent in the context of authoritarianism and conflict, this conference seeks to move beyond this focus and complicate our understanding by bringing non-normative sexualities, and I would add genders, into the picture. So that's what we're here to think and talk about. Now, although I intend in this talk, as the title suggests, to speak mainly about how I see the relationship between Jasbir's notion of homonationalism and my own conceptualization of homocapitalism, I want to situate my thinking about these questions and that relationship in the context of contemporary queer politics in India. Why India? Because on the one hand, this is the authoritarianism I know best, but also because India has increasingly, depressingly become a laboratory in which to think about how authoritarianism functions, regardless of where we're situated and what our interests are. So even though this is going to be quite situated in India, it would be interesting, I think, to talk about what about this situation travels and what does not, right? And as we ask that question in all of the contexts that we study. So my thinking around these questions has recently been influenced by a collection of essays that I've read called Desire and Its Discontents, which is edited by Deepika Jain and Oishik Sarkar and will be published by Zuban Books. It brings together the writing of some of the most interesting and provocative queer Indian activists and academics. So what I'd like to do in this talk is first to give you a sense of some of the lines of inquiry and arguments in that book, which will then set the stage for, second, my thoughts on this complex relationship between homonationalism and homocapitalism, before, third, returning to the contemporary landscape of mobilization against Indian authoritarianism that we're living through. So Desire and Its Discontents is a book that plots the coordinates of queer Indian public culture. And it does this primarily through a discussion of recent queer legal history, the cases that many of you will be familiar with, Naz Foundation, Kaushal, Nalsa, Puttaswamy, Navtej Johar. What I'm interested in is the way in which this discussion is framed in the book. So in the introduction to the book, Deepika Jain and Oishik Sarkar argue that the narratives of queer emancipation that constitute and are engendered by these judicial pronouncements need to be understood, and I quote, in the larger context of the rise of Hindutva and Neoliberalism. And a number of the essays in the volume offer accounts of how these discourses, which are foundational to the current BJP ruling dispensation, are imbricated with queer emancipation, such as it is in contemporary India. Now, I imagine many of us know and understand homonationalism in Jasbir's original formulation as marking the global fault lines between the civilized and the savage. But I think given the increasing conflation of the Indian nation state with its Hindu majority, which is constituted through a demonization of non-Hindu groups, those fault lines now run through the Indian body politic. I think it's also important for us to recall how central the recognition of Islamophobia in the US war on terror was to the assemblage that Jasbir describes as homonationalism. And I think it's precisely that shared Islamophobia which saturates the public cultures of places like the United States, but also Israel, India, that allows homonationalism as an assemblage to be intelligible in these other contexts. So in one of the chapters in Desire and Its Discontents, a group of 4 authors, Jason Fernandez, Benedito Ferrao, Albertina Almeida, and Huma Dar, sketched the contours of what they call a Brahminic homonationalism, which constructs a putatively queer-friendly Hinduism in opposition to what is called the Judeo-Christian morality of Section 377, which is the provision of the Indian Penal Code that till 2018 criminalized homosexuality. Even as it seeks to remind us of the colonial provenance of homophobic law, this is what the phrase Judeo-Christian is intended to do, The reference to the Abrahamic religions, others contemporary religious minorities, while evoking a Hindu past that is imagined to be, and I quote these authors, casteless, classless, fully sensual, freely erotic, and equally available to all. So this is a kind of classic romanticization of the pre-colonial past. G. Iman Semmelar, one of the leading trans writers in India today, writes of what he calls the saffron washing of trans and queer histories, visible in legal arguments, judgments, the discourse of NGOs, and indeed some trans activists themselves. Seeking inclusion within the Hindu nation by portraying it as always already accepting of transness and gender nonconformity until the arrival of colonial invaders, such discursive moves are typical of a Savarna dominant caste post-colonialism that ceaselessly reiterates its putative subjection to white European colonialism while obscuring its own coloniality in the perpetuation of caste supremacism in the subcontinent. So there's beginning to be a very strong Dalit critique, or there has been actually for a while, a strong Dalit critique of post-colonial theory as focusing so intently on the white European colonizer versus native distinction that it has not paid or has conveniently obscured all of the hierarchies and distinctions within the category of native itself. Now, as Jasbir has so persuasively demonstrated, such maneuvers in the homo-nationalist assemblage perform a splitting function. There's a wonderful phrase in terrorist assemblages, factionalizing, fractalizing, fractioning. Performs this splitting function, separating race, class, caste, and gender-privileged queers from those in subordinate locations. Nowhere is this clearer than in the differential and uneven impact of those projects pursued most assiduously by the contemporary Hindu right. To give you an account of one of those projects, many of you will have heard of the Citizenship Amendment Act, which the BJP government has recently passed. Just by way of background, responding to long-running anti-migrant protests by ethnic majority populations in India's northeastern state of Assam, the state has compiled a national register of citizens. This has been described by the journalist Rohini Mohan as one of the largest purges of citizenship in history. It's an exercise that required all Assamese residents to demonstrate proof of their citizenship. Now, while the Assamese agitation has historically been directed at all non-Assamese immigrants, regardless of religion, the Hindu supremacist BJP championed the demand for the NRC and promised to roll it out on a countrywide basis on the assumption that the exercise would disenfranchise mostly Muslims. It didn't bargain for the possibility that many of the 1.9 million people in a state with a population of 33 million who were left off the register because they failed to meet the onerous documentary requirements of the NRC would be Hindus. So it then passed the Citizenship Amendment Act, which offers a fast track to citizenship for non-Muslims fleeing religious persecution in predominantly Muslim Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Bangladesh. So this is a piece of legislation that masquerades as refugee protection, when in fact it's actually intended to provide a safety net to non-Muslims only who are left off the NRC. Indian citizenship law has gradually become more restrictive over several decades, but this may be the first time that a formal religious qualification has been introduced for Indian citizenship. So alongside the saffron washing of trans history, Semmelar, but also other writers like Brian Horton remind us of the ways in which trans people are disproportionately likely to have failed the documentation requirements of the NRC, often missing in state records as a result of migration, the non-registration of gender marker changes or name changes, and the lack of strong ties with natal families who have often disowned them. Trans people face an exponentially higher risk here, as they do in many places, of detention and deportation as a result of their inability to evidence citizenship. So this is an example of the ways in which Hindutva performs this kind of fractionalizing and factioning function. So like Hindutva, the neoliberal discursive register of homonationalism also operates to split off queers deemed deserving of inclusion from those seen as undeserving of this privilege. For many years now, writers such as Ratna Kapoor, Ashley Tellis, and Aniruddha Datta have been alerting us to the elitism of the queer movement in India on the basis of class, gender, religion. More recently, an electrifying Dalit critique of queer politics, advanced by writers and activists such as Dhiren Borissa, Akhil Kang, Dhrubo Jyoti, Sumit Bodh, Living Smile Vidya, Grace Banu, and others, has called out the caste politics of the movement, about which I shall say more later. Much of the class critique of the movement has focused on the implications of the centrality of privacy claims in arguments for decriminalization of queer sex. It's often been argued that the queer movement betrays its elitism in grounding arguments for discrimination on privacy, which is only ever the prerogative of those who own and control private space. So I'm moving on to the second part now. If queer emancipation has been complicitous with Hindu and neoliberal values, what remains to be theorized is the relationship between Hindutva and neoliberalism. Now, much ink has been spilled on this question, analyzing the precise and shifting configuration of forces within the Hindu right committed to these dual and intertwined projects. What interests me here is the relationship between strategies for queer emancipation that rely on Hindu homonationalism and neoliberalism, respectively. In my book, Out of Time, The Queer Politics of Postcoloniality, I suggest that we need to supplement the civilizationalist logic of Puar's homonationalism with the political economy logic of what I call homocapitalism. I developed this argument out of a study of the global reverberations of the Ugandan Anti-Homosexuality Act 2014, which earned notoriety for its draconian provisions, as well as for the well-documented involvement of US-based Christian evangelical activists who lobbied for its passage. One of the most high-profile global reactions to the law came from the World Bank, which 3 days after its passage in February 2014 announced that it was withholding a $90 million loan to Uganda that was to have funded maternal and infant care and family planning. But India was also emerging as a key terrain for the bank's interventions in LGBT rights. In the same month as the bank withheld this loan, it released preliminary results of a study estimating the cost of homophobia to the Indian economy at between 0.1 and 1.7% of its 2012 GDP. And a subsequent study by the bank of 39 countries makes the converse argument that the inclusion of LGBT people, as measured by the recognition of rights enumerated by the Global Index on Legal Recognition of Homosexual Orientation and the Transgender Rights Index, correlates positively with increases in per capita GDP and a higher ranking on the Human Development Index. Basically, these are studies purporting to demonstrate that when a state recognizes a right on these indexes, its GDP will grow by X%. So the threat of capital withdrawal and the promise of capital infusion have begun to emerge in parallel with homonationalism's Orientalist discourses of civilizational superiority and backwardness as proselytizing strategies for queer liberalism. In many ways, the logics of homonationalism and homocapitalism resonate with one another. Just as homonationalism selectively incorporates within the nation gender, race, class, and caste-privileged forms of queerness, while disavowing others who coalesce into figurations of the monster terrorist fag. I'm thinking here of Jasbir's work with Amit Rai. Homocapitalism holds out the promise of inclusion for those forms of queerness that can demonstrate themselves to be integral to projects of economic growth and productivity, while relegating others to fates of poverty and incarceration. So a similar double move of incorporation and abjection. Besides splintering queer movements, both logics also operate to separate queer movements from what might otherwise appear to be likely allies. So Jason Fernandez et al. In this book, Desire and Its Discontents, pointedly note that queer rage against surveillance in the bedroom imposed by a colonial law has not extended to struggles against the surveillance of the Indian state in its occupation of Kashmir and the impunity with which it is able to operate under cover of other laws of colonial provenance, such as the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. In a similar vein, the increasing salience of what might be called the homo-capitalist assemblage attenuates any investment that the queer movement might otherwise have had in the many ongoing anti-capitalist struggles against displacement, deregulation, and privatization. Yet, even as a shared commitment to liberal political and economic values allows homonationalism and homocapitalism to resonate with and reinforce one another as if they were components of the same assemblage, there are moments in which I think they part company. Indeed, I would go so far as to suggest that these are instances in which homocapitalism does not simply supplement homonationalism in the sense of overdetermining its force, but begins to supplant it. There are three ways in which I think this might happen. Maybe there are more, but these are the three that I can think of at the moment. First, the tropes of civilization and barbarism on which homonationalism relies do not always work in the way that they are intended to. Faced with the suggestion that LGBT rights have become a new marker of civilizational superiority, it is open to targets of this discourse to argue, as some have done, that what some consider progress is to them a sign of civilizational decay, and indeed to champion alternative orderings of sex, gender, and sexuality as vehicles for their own claims to moral and political leadership. So I'm thinking here about Russia's championing of traditional values discourse, just one example. Dominant versions of homonationalism can thus be opposed by counter-nationalisms that are structurally homologous with them, even if invested with morally antithetical content. In contrast, as the space for alternatives to capitalism shrinks, it is arguably more difficult to resist the claim and seductions of homocapitalism in a kind of counter-capitalist register. Insofar as survival is contingent on the accumulation of capital in a capitalist world system, it is more difficult for states and societies to disavow development trajectories that promise capital accumulation. While counter-hegemonic forces have sometimes fantasized about counter-capitalisms, I'm thinking here of early post-independence bourgeois nationalist regimes that fantasized about the possibility of autonomous capitalism. The global and inescapably interconnected nature of capitalism makes it more difficult for such forms of resistance to sustain their autonomous existence. This means that whereas the weight of homonationalism can be, and sometimes is, opposed by counter-nationalisms, homocapitalism can be meaningfully resisted only in an anti-capitalist register. While homonationalism works when it does through an arousal of anxiety in those stigmatized as barbaric for being stranded on the wrong side of modernity, homocapitalism relies on a strategy of seduction that promises full entry into a capitalist futurity for those who heed its dictates. Contrasted with the fullness and apparent generosity of homocapitalism's promise, there is something less than persuasive, a little bit miserly maybe, about homonationalism. We know from Homi Bhabha's influential theorization of the instabilities and contradictions of colonial stereotypes that the racial logic of colonial civilizing missions promises a future in which native mimic men get to be almost white, but not quite. In contrast, the capitalist logic underwriting homocapitalism holds out the promise, however unrealistic and unrealized in practice, of a future in which queer liberal subjects might enjoy full market citizenship. It's important to bear in mind that I'm talking about ideology here, right? Not what happens, but what is what the ideology of these formations claim. Now, given the extent to which Hindu and more especially Brahminic homonationalism is underwritten by the category of caste, we can also observe clearly the closedness of this kind of homonationalism, that is Hindu homonationalism, in contrast with the apparent openness of Indian homocapitalism. B.R. Ambedkar, whom many of you will be familiar with as the Dalit visionary and lead drafter of the Indian Constitution, believed that the Varna system, the caste system, was originally a class system in which individuals could change their class, but became a closed-door caste system when Brahmins enclosed themselves into a unit with the characteristics of a caste. Pondering the question of whether other castes were compelled to close doors and become endogamous, Ambedkar suggests in an important essay that he writes in 1917 that some closed the door, others found it closed against them. These mechanisms of enclosure have profound material and psychic implications for how Hindu homonationalism operates today, as well as for how resistant identities such as Dalit are conceived and inhabited. In contrast with the theoretical promise of liberal equality extended by homocapitalist discourse, Hindu homonationalism functions in the way Hinduism has always done, through at best a grudging, politically opportunistic and hierarchical inclusion, which recalls its modus operandi vis-a-vis subordinate castes and Adivasis, and outright exclusion and elimination, which recalls its modus operandi vis-a-vis Muslims. In sum, whereas homonationalism relies to a greater degree on coercion and stigmatization for its persuasiveness, and even then never quite promises full inclusion, Homocapitalism elicits consent with its promise of a rosy future of growth, productivity, and full inclusion on liberal capitalist terms. Now, I don't want to suggest that homocapitalism lacks a coercive dimension. All we have to do is to recall that the bank was withdrawing $90 million from Uganda to remind ourselves of the way in which this coercion operates. But I do wonder if the balance of coercion and consent in homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism might be different. And here I'm reminded of Ranajit Guha's distinction, Gramscian distinction between dominance and hegemony. So in that language, I might say that whereas homo-nationalism tends towards dominance, homo-capitalism tends towards hegemony. Second way in which these logics might differ is perhaps apparent in these moments when they appear to have a relative autonomy from one another. And I think that might be evident in moments where homo-nationalist discourses have not succeeded or have not yet succeeded in persuading recalcitrant state institutions to embrace queer subjects, providing an opening for homo-capitalism to exploit. A small example of this, in December 2013, when the example is, the particular illustration I give is a minor one. I'm sure we could multiply these illustrations. But in December 2013, when the Indian Supreme Court affirmed the constitutional validity of the anti-queer Section 377 with a devastatingly retrograde judgment, subsequently overruled in 2018, but I'm taking us back to the earlier 2013 moment, major Indian corporations responded with advertisements that underscored their opposition to the decision. The luxury jeweler Tanishq advertised a set of glittering earrings with the slogan, "Two of a kind always make a beautiful pair." Earrings, two of the same kind. Hashtag Section 377. Others invited their customers to come out of the closet, etc. We're very familiar with this kind of corporate advertising. We can see a similar phenomenon at work more recently when, in the wake of Black Lives Matter protests against the state's racialized violence and incarceration, corporations have extravagantly proclaimed their anti-racist credentials, not just corporations, but universities, which are also corporations. These are dangerous but analytically useful moments in which the non-identity of interests between the state and market become apparent. Vulnerable to attack by the state, radicals can be tempted into alliances with the market against the state. These alliances allow the market to accrue a form of moral capital, with which perhaps to later fend off state regulation, even when this is justified on progressive grounds. Meanwhile, some queers acquire a stake in the success of capitalism, seeing it as tied up in their own liberation. Now, Jasbir is, of course, deeply attentive to this triangular relationship between state, market, and queer citizen/consumer, recognizing, as she puts it, that the market is a foil for the state, producing consumer subjects as well as highly skilled laborers that simulate and experience simulated affective modes of belonging to the state, modes that assuage the angst of unrequited love. I love that phrase. Market privileges, she explains, masquerade as forms of belonging to the nation and mediate the humiliation of waiting for national love. Elsewhere, I think she says the market offers placebo rights to queers who have not been hailed by the state and its legislators, right? So, but I think there is a tendency later in the argument to fold market and national inclusion into one another as, and I quote, convivial and complicitous rather than oppositional entities. And by way of example, she tells us how gay and lesbian consumers in the US were hailed in the immediate aftermath of the September 11th terrorist attacks by the tourism industry, which reframed the act of going on holiday as a performance of patriotic consumption that would restore the US nation's psychic and economic health. While I find this reading very compelling, I want to hold open the possibility that racial, caste, national, and market logics may not always align, and that the prospects for emancipation might sometimes be contingent on deepening these contradictions. So before I get to a specific example of that, which will take us back to India, I want to just maybe think about a third distinction between homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism, which is that perhaps they operate on distinct temporal terrains. Homo-nationalism's gendered and sexualized rewriting of the standard of civilization calls to mind earlier iterations of this standard as a barometer of fitness for sovereignty in international society. And that's, again, a phrase I take from one of Jasbir's pieces. As several commentators have pointed out, the most recent manifestations of this standard of civilization appear deeply ironic in light of early colonial history. Whereas the Orient was once denigrated for its sexual decadence and licentiousness, it is now castigated for its repression. Writers like Neville Horde and Afsane Najmabadi have shown this very compellingly. Moreover, as we are often reminded, many of the anti-queer laws against which Global South activists struggle today are remnants of colonial penal codes. It is precisely because the past can be a somewhat embarrassing terrain for liberal white Western LGBT activists to engage with, precluding their assumption of the high moral ground in conversations about LGBT rights, that some have come to prefer the terrain of futurity on which the promises of homocapitalism are articulated. This thought comes out of a very specific conversation with a white British LGBT activist who said, look, we need to, by we he means white Western activists like himself, need to stop talking about morality because this invariably triggers conversations about where these anti-queer laws come from, colonial penal codes, and how the standard of civilization is arbitrarily changed from one historical moment to the next. He says there's too much embarrassing colonial baggage in conversations that focus on the past, so we need to speak in terms of economics in the future in order to be able to persuade these actors that we're trying to push away from these laws. So it comes out of a very specific conversation with somebody who articulates very clearly this preferred shift in temporal terrain. We can see analogous differences in temporal orientation in the queer politics of contemporary India. Whereas Hindu homonationalism, like Hindutva more generally, evokes a golden Hindu past that is sullied by Muslim invasion and, to a curiously lesser extent, British colonization, queer neoliberal discourses look forward to a rising, emerging India whose entry into the club of great powers is eagerly anticipated but endlessly deferred. So let me finally come to my third section, where I want to think about what might happen in these moments where we can prize apart, or where there might be opportunities to prize apart Hindutva and neoliberalism. Now, it might be argued that the tensions between Hindutva and neoliberalism are less apparent in the ideology of the Indian middle classes that support the current ruling dispensation. As Aniruddha Datta has suggested in studying elite LGBT activism in West Bengal, this kind of activism seeks equality through a double move, both contesting and reclaiming national culture and identity on the one hand, and evoking transnationally circulating models of liberal democracy and sexual identification on the other. And as Partho Chatterjee has long argued, the anti-colonial nationalist project, of which contemporary middle-class ideologies are a successor, always combined a spiritual discourse of cultural supremacy vis-a-vis the West, but also vis-a-vis minorities within the body politic, and a materialist anxiety that fuels a drive to mimic and catch up with what are perceived to be the more advanced parts of the world. In other words, Hindutva and neoliberalism go together seamlessly, and there's no contradiction. Certainly, the Hindu right has perfected an electoral strategy that appears to seamlessly combine the vicious cultural politics of Hindutva with a neoliberal commitment to deregulation and unrestrained capital accumulation by the most powerful actors in the economy. Yet we must be alert to, I think, and exploit the possibility that the electoral coalition forged on the back of one set of commitments might splinter in its encounter with the other. Partly, I'm prompted to think about this by the 2 winters of discontent that the Narendra Modi government has faced. These have been some of the largest and most determined mobilizations that the politics of the Hindu right has ever elicited, interrupted only by the year of COVID in between. I mean, we're still living through COVID. But in both the winter we've just come through, as well as the previous one, we've seen these immense mobilizations. So the passage of the CAA, which I described earlier in December 2019, precipitated what some commentators described as the most significant upheaval since the emergency in 1975, in protest against the law's unprecedented introduction of religious qualifications for Indian citizenship. How do we understand these? This is simply the latest in a long series of culture wars issues that the BJP has raked up against Muslims. In a very interesting essay that Divya Dwivedi, Shaj Mohan, and Jay Raghu recently published in the Caravan magazine, they have argued that the BJP's anti-Muslim communal politics works to divert attention from caste antagonisms effectively welding together a coalition of dominant and subordinate caste groups under the sign of the Hindu. And we can see this in operation in communal riots and communal violence, where the BJP has drawn in subordinate caste factions by positing the Hindu-Muslim axis or the Hindu-Muslim fault line as the primary antagonism in society. I think there's something really comparable going on here with the way in which W.E.B. Du Bois reads racial supremacism in the US South as providing the public and psychological wage to white labor that eventually sutures it to the white planter class while obviating the formation of class alliances with black labor. This is what subsequent commentators have called the wages of whiteness. And in a similar way, I think we can see the wages of Hindutva cementing communal allegiances with a view to undermining caste antagonisms. Yet the stability of these allegiances is by no means assured. So since September 2020, when the government hastily passed 3 farm laws that open up India's agricultural sector to large domestic and foreign agribusiness corporations and also threaten to dismantle state control of agricultural markets, farmers have organized massive protests. The mobilization of November 2020, when hundreds of thousands of tractors traveling from villages in Punjab and Haryana towards New Delhi converged with a general strike by trade unions with an estimated 250 million members across the country, has been described as arguably the largest in human history. For over a century, ideologues of Hindutva have disingenuously claimed Sikhism as well as Buddhism and Jainism to be part of the fold of Hinduism on account of territorial provenance. But here in these protests, we see Sikh identity as much as left ideology openly invoked against the Hindu government. And predictably, this has evoked memories and charges of Khalistani separatism and anti-nationalism. More significantly, the pervasiveness of agrarian distress in Punjab that the new farm laws threaten to intensify has created openings for solidarities across fractures of class and caste between land-owning Jat farmers and landless Dalit laborers. As Amardeep Singh Dhillon notes in a recent piece, while at least some of the Jat farmers in the current movement have been implicated in violence against Dalit Muslim laborers in the past, particularly in Uttar Pradesh, there is every possibility, and that word possibility is important, not certainty, that the ongoing Kisan Andolan, farmers' struggle, might persuade them that they have more in common with each other against the forces of neoliberalism and Hindutva. At any rate, the actualization of these possibilities, again, not certainties, is the work of progressive politics in the present. So in sum, the creation and consolidation of counter-hegemonic alliances might require us to locate and exacerbate the contradictions in the Hindu right project. And viewed through the preoccupations of a queer politics, we might want to do the same with respect to Homonationalism and Homocapitalism, instead of always folding them into one another. Even as we have learned to discern the contours of the Homonationalist assemblage, I want to suggest that a sharper appreciation of its distinct logics may make us less vulnerable to the seductions of an emerging and sometimes autonomous Homocapitalism. More ambitiously, we might begin to explore the contradictions between these frames with a view to evading and eluding the logics of both. And if I may just end on a personal note again, when I've read about the farmers' protests, I've been mapping the location of the protests and the sit-ins and the encampments on Google Maps on the roads leading out of Delhi through Tikri border and Singhu border into Haryana. And I realized that this is exactly where Jasbir and I first met at a conference in Jindal University in Sonipat, which is very close to where these protests are happening. And that conference was organized by the very editors of the book that I began this talk with. So it seems fitting to return to that place today, not so much to the shiny neoliberal private university within whose conference halls we met, but to the road outside where authoritarianism is being confronted as we speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. That was so beautiful, and thanks for the reminder about the convergence with the book, the protest sites, and where we first started talking. I begin by acknowledging that the land that I'm speaking from today is the original homelands of the Mashpi Wampang Ag. I acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory, and I honor and respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land. I feel very fortunate to have this opportunity to engage with Rahul's work. We have been interlocutors since we met, as explained, in 2010. And Out of Time feels like the concretization of Rahul's thinking that I had been apprehending in bits and pieces and over years of exchange. But Rahul, please don't call me an academic godmother just yet. I'm not ready for it. So I have a series of questions for Rahul that's folded into response. So the conversation is not going to start just quite yet, but in about 20 minutes. I want to thank also the conference organizers and all of the sponsoring units, and Marchan and Hakan for inviting me, and also just to recognize the work that has gone into and that they've done to create this brilliant conference. And I'm really looking forward to the events over the next several days. So at the virtual launch of Out of Time in May 2020, Rahul proclaimed, "Now that we have understood homonationalism, we have overcorrected for it." So suddenly a fog of anxiety that had been with me for years started clearing. Since the publication of Terrorist Assemblages 14 years ago, I had become increasingly aware that the invocation of homonationalism was becoming performative. It was producing the thing that it was claiming to name. And insofar as the dilemmas about whether and how theory travels are irresolvable, the distinction between an analytic and its deployment is a kind of false one. But I would say that homonationalism is only useful as an analytic if we acknowledge that its own theoretical force transits through the various circuits of empire, of settler colonialism, of neoliberal multiculturalism, developmentalism, and indeed, as Matthew Brim has forcefully argued in his recent book, Poor Queer Studies, uneven academic privileges, that it all seeks to upend. So in fact, we might say that insofar as homonationalism has become a kind of soundbite that is far afield from the context of its initial articulation, it has traveled precisely through the circuits of homocapitalism. So when taken up as a status theory, the limits of homocapitalism are readily apparent. It seems like a portable construct, when indeed, as Rahul's and so many other people's work has shown, it is not. This overcorrection is precisely the performativity that I speak of, a kind of applied use of homonationalism as a theory of the state, accompanied by a subsuming orientalizing of local nation-state actors that might have far more important things to deal with than tarrying with these discourses of the West. Rao convincingly intervenes not only through staging a reversal of actors, the rest to the West, or arguing for a subaltern sexuality of the global South. Rather, he's emphasizing these solicitous transit of global, regional, sub and paranational entities populating the movements for LGBTQ rights in Uganda and India. So the World Bank, the IMF, NGOs, Western governmental aid, networks which impel acquiescence to LGBTQ rights platforms promising economic growth and productivity. And for Rahul, these networks are marked by collaboration and transaction across North-South divides, and ideologies that are forged in interaction between elite LGBT activists and technocrats in these international financial institutions. And he writes, denied belonging within the nation, some activists have turned to making the case for inclusion, not in a language of justice or human rights, but through a refiguration of the queer model capitalist subject, whose inclusion promises a future of growth and economic dynamism. And as Rahul has explained, that this argument has been embraced by IFIs eager to rehabilitate themselves, brandishing an image of progressiveness, inveighing against homophobia in the global South. This is all language from Out of Time. So my sense is that the cultural and civilizational alibis of homonationalism, so our investments in liberal codes of progress, acceptance, and inclusion, are no less salient now, especially as they are increasingly discarded, if not destroyed, by authoritarian regimes. Insofar as Trump inverted American exceptionalism and defiantly flaunted what we otherwise know to be the facade of civility, leaving so many aghast, these liberal codes might be more activated than ever, yet increasingly meaningless. So homonationalism was never not driven by negotiations of capitalist reward. But what Rahul's work has really clarified to me in recent years is that the schema of homonationalism that I lay out in Terrorist Assemblages suffers from a lack of analysis of capitalism. And that's not to say that there isn't attention to materialism, particularly in the way of affect, but what counts as materiality is a whole other a conversation, I think. So there is attention to how neoliberal multiculturalism produces economic vectors of racial difference. But the argument itself is not anti-capitalist. And here I really appreciate Rao's repeatedly stated desire for, quote, a specifically queer investment in anti-capitalist critique. And so I am wondering if homonationalism, not just the fact of it, but my presentation of the analysis of it, is it symptomatic of this split between the economic and the cultural that is indeed the hallmark of neoliberalism? What Rao refers to, echoing earlier work from Judith Butler, a fantasy about the merely cultural. As a grammar of the state that sets the terms of recognition, homonationalism works in the service of foiling the question of capitalism and the politics of redistribution. There's not just a reiteration of a cultural economic binary at work, but Pace earlier debates between Judith Butler and Nancy Fraser. Again, this is all coming from the conversation that Rahul stages in Out of Time. The recognition redistribution binary. So paraphrasing Lisa Dugan, Rao notes that the distinction between recognition and redistribution is a ruse through which neoliberal capitalism pretends to become more inclusive by seizing on a low-cost way of projecting a new queer friendliness, unquote. And so this queer friendliness is related to the example that Rahul raises of the tourism industry. It's not the general tourism industry, I think I was talking about terrorist assemblages, but the very specific lesbian and gay tourism industry post 9/11 that was inciting a kind of greater participation in travel, in international travel. So that convergence is only remarkable precisely because there was no such prior alignment. For decades, the lesbian and gay tourism industry, and more generally, we could say the production of LGBTQ populations as ideal consumers available for what Rahul calls full market citizenship. So this industry narrated itself as a compensatory strata that ameliorated the paucity, if not absence, of state recognition through its self-proclaimed status as a supranational formation, one determined to produce the conditions of gay friendliness through pink dollars wherever it sought to do so. Queer mobility and freedom equaled economic mobility and vice versa. And the industry was as interested in the disciplining of homophobia through capital as it was in maintaining a sexually lascivious Orientalist project of homophobic danger elsewhere. So I'm wondering, a question that I had been thinking through with Rahul is this a kind of proto-homocapitalism, one that foregrounded the queer as consumer citizen and in the mode of kind of current day implications of developmentalism and queer mobility. And I think when we're talking about homocapitalism, I'm wondering if we're looking at and perhaps inadvertently conflating, or I'm reading in a conflating way, but three scales: the state, queer global South LGBTQ movements that are infused with capital from global North sources, and the third scale, a queer liberal subject conditioned through the promise of capitalist rewards and upward mobility. I think all three of these scales are, explicated in Rahul's book really, really well, but I want to get some more clarity on how they're all working together. So moving the discussion from the oft-regarded clash of civilizations with its focus on cultures of nations and religions, rights and recognition, Rahul's analysis foregrounds the materiality of geopolitical orderings of the global theater of nation-state alliances. And as he explicates, homonationalism and homocapitalism are not necessarily oppositional. And I think of them as juxtaposed through a series of supplementary relationships that shift depending on place and scale and the construction of location. So Rahul writes, quote, "The civilizationist logic of homonationalism must be supplemented with the political economy logic of homocapitalism, end quote. So this statement seems to me to affirm the very cultural economic split that Rao problematizes and is seeking to redress. But I read in this very, in this split, the very logic of a kind of Derridian supplementarity that forces a performative iteration of this split. And it allows us to see both what was elided and what has shifted. Supplementarity can signal a secondary status that enhances the position of the primary or the original. It can be a relation of accretion, so adding in order to enhance. It can be a relation of substitution, adding to replace, to supplant, to use Rahul's language. And I think all of these things are happening, right? Both of these things are happening. The process of supplementation is an indefinite one, focusing on places where homosexuality remains or is being criminalized and where, quote, LGBT movements owe their very origins to the dynamism and reach of neoliberal capital. Rao writes, quote, the promise of futurity inherent in homocapitalism may prove to be more seductive where the chastisement of homonationalism has not yet succeeded in drawing recalcitrant states into its embrace, or worse, has raised their anti-imperialist shackles. Indeed, precisely as a result of the intellectual, even if not political, success of the critique of homonationalism, homocapitalism may be emerging as the weapon of choice wielded by a global queer liberalism. So this sentence intrigues me because it suggests that this overcorrection that Rahul speaks of is indicative of a pharmacon, a poison, a cure, and a scapegoat all at once. I'm reminded of what South Asian studies and queer theory scholar Anjali Arandekar said to me a long time ago when we were in graduate school in 1998, that resistance to queer theory in the Indian Academy was not due to homophobia so much as an annoyance with the imperious orientations and indeed imperial transits of the US Academy. And yet Rao also insists that post-colonial populations cannot be excused from what he calls queerphobia, and also a tendency towards homo-romanticism, which he describes as an affective stance in which the queer predicaments of the post-colonial world are attributed entirely to its colonial experience, with the agency of post-colonial elites in co-producing these predicaments being obscured, end quote. And he also talks about this homo-romanticism as the kind of space within which the deployment of homophobia becomes part of decolonial resistance. And I think Rahul had kind of laid out thinking through of the temporalities of decolonial resistance in relation to queerphobia that was incredibly productive and persuasive. And I'd love for Rahul to say a little bit more about this. And as we heard, Rahul also points to these two distinct technologies of power being exercised, coercion and dominance, right? And and coercion, dominance, and complicity and consent, right? I appreciate this distinction very much. But I'm wondering, given that both homonationalism and homocapitalism are mapping out relations of incorporation and objection, what, Rahul, you think about disciplining as a modality of power running across these two forms, homonationalism, homocapitalism? Would you accept my momentary revert to biopolitics most directly impacted by the war on terror, specifically the Middle East and West Asia, the militarization and securitization effects of civilizational disciplining? This isn't just any disciplining, right? It's one driven by Orientalism and Islamophobia. And I'm glad that Rahul mentioned, the context of the war on terror. In the years after 9/11, friends who worked at Human Rights Watch, and Helm in Lebanon, Aswat in Palestine, and Al-Qaus, also in Palestine, and other human rights organizations noted the onslaught of humanitarian, NGO, and even state-driven opportunities cashing in on the marketization of the purported novelty of Muslim queers in the MENA region. So as one of my activist friends commented, as this money started drying out in the 2010s, Africa had become the new Middle East for these efforts. So while this is anecdotal, I think this is an affective registering that capital might move on as it were. And it's another example of the kind of interplay between homonationalism and homocapitalism. Rahul argues that since the discursive weight of homocapitalism can be and is sometimes opposed by counter-nationalisms, homocapitalism can be meaningfully resisted only in an anti-capitalist register. So given the material punishments and rewards that homonationalism is tied to and generates and impels, I'm not so quick to parse out the discursive as if homonationalism is merely discursive. But I share with Rahul concern about how the critique of homonationalism might contribute to a sidestepping of the specifically queer investments in anti-capitalism that Rahul is so tenaciously holding forth with. In the second half of this, I want to continue this discussion about caste and gender and the farmers' protests in a beautiful chapter on the tactical use of the caste category of backwardness by queer and trans Dalit activists to lobby for state recognition in India. Rao observes the Mobius strip quality of caste and gender relations, stating that caste is the regulation of gender, which is caste. And there's a sentence that I truly love. Rahul writes, in a neoliberal India dominated by a caste Hindu right, collective Dalit assertion in the terms advocated by Ambedkar is queerer than a same-sex kiss, end quote. So I do love the sentence for so many reasons, especially for how it shifts the register of what constitutes what he calls a radically anti-assimilationist project of queer politics, where the annihilation of caste is not just enabling Dalits to become like caste Hindus, but is actually about a new Dalit subjectivity marked by revolutionary consciousness. And he sees this revolutionary consciousness as the way in which the destruction of caste becomes imbricated with gender transition. So as with the general strike, the farmers' protests have been hailed as the largest in all of human history. Outside of South Asia and Sikh-specific forums, I have not seen that they have merited much attention to these emergent radical politics and solidarity formations. I am wondering and asking Rahul to think with me about how these formations might challenge Western leftist sensibilities. Certainly this is a fear from some of the Sikh commentators that I've been listening to. While the three farm laws are about Indian agricultural labor writ large, Bikram Gill has recently argued that there's a specific existentialist crisis in Punjab that is animating these protests, and it has been long in the making. And Gill also argues that Sikhs are, quote, rethinking our internalized religious practices in this political organizing context, such that he says, nothing will be the same again, end quote. And those of us connected to Punjab really, really feel that way, feel that. There has been both a lauding of, but also a repoliticization of Sikhi, the tenets of Sikhism, as fundamentally informing the organization and conduct of the protesters. This hailing, again, has been especially moving in the Sikh diaspora as a connection to the protests, deeply familial, religious, spiritual, entangled with these traumas of partition and migration. And also very much so marked by this question, how do we support from a distance? Here's another question. Is this a secular protest? It's not exactly a non-secular protest. And maybe these are not the right terms. And indeed, a kind of rigid secular religious binary opens the way, as Rahul mentioned, for vilification of the protests as a revival of the Khalistani movement of the 70s and 80s. These are thin lines that are being navigated, whether and how to protest a Sikh without being dismissed as a terrorist, how to respond to myriad forms of Indian state violence, including killings, disappearances, incarceration, and most recently, sexual assault of female activists without being stereotyped as warriors, how to resist the neoliberalism of the Indian state without being vilified as traitorous or seditious. So there has been much lauding in Sikh forums about the praxis of langar at the protests, the communal cooking, feeding, and eating that is part of a broader philosophy of seva, which is a means of service to others and to all. From the advent of Sikhism, langar was envisioned as an anti-caste practice which included women as a caste, so anti-gender segregation. In practice, the commitment to these ideals vary. Again, we're talking about ideology, as Rahul mentioned, and it doesn't at all mitigate the fact that, as Rahul points out, the caste differences are sutured through land to the violence of the owner-laborer relationship, as well as to Sikh patriarchy. At the protests, langar is a form of conviviality that, according to Navya Gill, among other commentators, challenges caste, though its challenges to gender dissolution have been far less commented upon. Langar is part of the sustainability of these protest spaces and feeding not only the farmers, but also neighboring communities. And it's also what we might otherwise see as a kind of mutual aid, right? It's not charity, it's not pooling resources, it's not crisis intervention. Rather, langar is a mode of envisioning more egalitarian forms of communalizing on the affective, corporeal, ecological levels. Langar is a venerable Sikh institution, it's a theological philosophy, it's a conceptual space, and it's a horizon of becoming rooted in the ongoing work of relationality. So on Sikh Twitter, which has been for months abuzz with in real-time updates on the farmers' protests, casteist harassment of queer and trans and Dalit Sikhs by cis-hetero Jat Sikhs began last fall and intensified in February. So these trolls are supporters, if not participants, in the farmers' protests who espouse a Jat Sikh pride, in part through vicious queerphobic and transphobic anti-caste vitriol. There's also been the kind of lauding of female leaders, union organizers, and activists who highlight how women are central to these agrarian economies, yet disenfranchised in them. But then alongside that, a kind of denunciation of any self-declared feminist approaches that point out the kind of deep patriarchal violence against women in Punjab. So, but in response to this specific specific casteism, transphobia, and queerphobia on Twitter, Manu and Manmit, a non-binary Dalit and a trans Sikh, respectively, penned a series of brilliant articles challenging the failure to realize the radical potential of Sikhi within the terms of Sikhi itself. So they write, Sikhi annihilated caste, but this was not a passive proclamation, but an active disavowal of the caste system through instituting various measures like Pangit, Sangit, and Langar. And they go on to remind the community that equality and liberation does not rest in mere statements or the lack thereof, but instead in an active commitment to dismantling casteist cis heteronormativity. Elsewhere, they call this the Brahminical Jat cis heteropatriarchal order. In my mind, this is a kind of Mobius strip of gender and caste that exemplified that Rahul talks about. I'm also thinking about what Rahul just said about the emancipation contingent on deepening contradictions as a kind of dialectical process. And I'm wondering if this is kind of the way he would see these antagonisms in these protests kind of fueling transformation. What I find so compelling about these interventions is that they don't profess longer to be queer practice, but as a space of Sikhi cohered through the multiplicities of gender and the banishing of caste. Queer, trans, and Dalit response to Hindu homonationalism is not based on a counter homonationalism, but on what already exists within the folds of Sikhi. The radical force of queer and trans and Dalit Sikhs emanates from within, not from outside or externally to the Sangit, the congregation. In other words, there's no true Sikhi without queer and trans and Dalit Sikhs. This has been condemned as blasphemous, as a blasphemous statement, and yet the religious principles confirm it to be true. And finally, Manu and Manmit acknowledge the presence that is already there. And they say, may our Vaheguru have kirpa on the caste oppressed and queer and trans farmers fighting within the Kisan Morcha right now. So unlike the queer and trans Dalit organizing that Rahul discusses, the anti-casteism politics amongst these young queer, trans, non-binary, and Dalit Sikhs are less wedded to the philosophies and legacy of Ambedkar, who once considered becoming Sikh, then to the anti-caste tenets of gender neutrality that embedded in the theologies of Sikhi. It's also, I would say, less routed through the kind of past, future, or tradition modernity duo that Rahul lays out. And that's not to deny the kind of elements of Sikh history that lend to archival reclamation, particularly in the oft elaborated, playful musings of whether the gurus were queer, for example. But rather than this relation to tradition and modernity, I read their demands as desires for a utopian radical Sikhi horizon, which would not be possible without achieving the dissolution of caste and gender differences. Radical Sikhi, therefore, would only strengthen these struggles for sustainable agrarian futures. And in fact, as Manu and Manmit make clear in their missives, Langar and the other tenets of Seva cannot be truly practiced without challenging casteism, queerphobia, and transphobia, and without recognizing how queer, trans, and Dalit lives have been integral to these world-making institutions of Sikhi. So far from being distractions from the anti-neoliberal, anti-capitalist thrust of these farmers' protests, which is what some of us have been told, this vision of radical Sikhi is at the heart of an evolved resistance movement. And as Rahul notes, this is progressive politics in the present. It is in the making. I'm interested in how these two strands of anti-caste commitments, Ambedkar and Sikhi, are entwined, especially given Ambedkar's interest in Sikh ideals, but his concerns about the active hostility towards Dalits. And Rahul, this is where I know very little, and I'm interested in your thoughts on how the two strands might together further open the possibilities for a politics of backwardness. This query is about both history and philosophy, but it's also a speculative one. And also to your final point, Rahul, about resistance, what are the kinds of challenges to Hindu homonationalism and Indian homocapitalism that you see emerging on the ground from the farmers' protests? And just to close, I want to add to the many expressions of solidarity from Sikh diasporas from all over the world, really, with the protesters, and to affirm how inspirational these protests have been and continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, for those amazingly comprehensive and thought-provoking talks. And we'd like to open this up to questions. I know there's already quite a few questions in the chat, but I'd like to begin by turning to Hakan to start the questions.
Thank you so much. This was a brilliant conversation, and we are left with many questions as well. I wanted to ask, of course, Rahul, if you want to respond to Jasbir's questions, please start with that as well. But you offer a more complicated big picture, of course, but a big distinction that you're drawing here is that homonationalism works by evoking anxiety, whereas homocapitalism invites people to take its side and become part of it, not necessarily through force, but through seduction. Can you elaborate on how you think resistance to homonationalism and homocapitalism is shaped or influenced by these very different strategies? And how can we think about these resistances or counter strategies in terms of transnationalism and maybe cosmopolitanism?
Thanks, Hakan, and thank you, Jasbir, for those really rich and thought-provoking comments. I don't think I can do justice to all of them now, but I'm going to be thinking about them for a while. I think before I speak to Hakan's question, I want to just go back to one of the first questions you raised, Jasbir, which is this point about whether the laying out of the homo-nationalist analytic was symptomatic of a split between the economic and the cultural. I actually don't read it that way. I think your laying out of homo-nationalism had both of those things in there. But I think that perhaps my reading of it, or the way in which it tended to be taken up, saw the economic and the cultural as mostly resonant with each other. And I was interested in the moments of dissonance, in the moments where they part company and don't work together, and in what kinds of possibilities that might offer from the point of view, well, both of alerting ourselves to other ways in which queer liberalism works, perhaps more subliminally, in ways that we might be less alert to. And this is where I think the distinction between anxiety and seduction might be interesting to think about, in the sense that the sort of the discourse, even though I think the assemblage is not just about its discourse, but the rhetorics of homonationalism are in some sense a reiteration of long-standing Orientalist tropes. And so there is a kind of, we've had historical warning of how this works. And I wonder if that makes us more alert to them. I don't think it's just about anxiety, because I think that anxiety also comes with a promise of what life would be like once one is on the other side of modernity. So there is an element of seduction there as well. But I think, as I was trying to suggest, it might also arouse a counter-reaction, which is a desire to demonstrate one's own cultural distinctiveness and supremacy. This is what Partho Chatterjee says when he talks about the material cultural split. There is a desire to mimic in material respects, but to maintain one's spiritual distinctiveness. And I wonder if that maps onto homonationalism and homocapitalism as well, a desire to retain one's spiritual distinctiveness, meaning to not give in to homonationalism, however powerful its inducements, but an anxiety that, and here I'm exchanging the terms, what does this mean for resistance? I think, I'm not sure about that question. I think understanding the possibility that the logics might be different is the first step to then thinking about how we might resist this. So that's perhaps where I would start answering that question.
I'm sure actually Jasbir might have a comment on that, but yeah, one comment. Okay, here we go.
I just wanted to say one thing, which is I really loved Rahul talking about homonationalism as kind of miserly, so it doesn't really pay off. But for me, the most effective use of homonationalism has been about American exceptionalism and covering over and hiding the queer phobia in the United States, right? That's what's being disciplined here, first and foremost. So I just wanted to add that to.
Okay, well, shall we come back to you, Hakan, for a reiteration of the question you had?
Of course, I guess Martin had a question as well, and Rahul will, I believe, answer as the discussion unfolds.
Okay, so over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much. I can see, thank you very much for the talks, first of all, really a lot of food for thought, and Rahul and Jasbir. And I can see there's a question in the chat box as well. Let me first perhaps ask the question that I have written here and then move to the next one that I can see in the chat. Rahul, you talked about how homocapitalism can be resisted by anti-capitalist work, right? And so I was wondering, can we think of instances in which queer activists strategically manipulate or employ the global capital to pursue their own ends in terms of justice? So in those instances, would homocapitalism still be a relevant point of analysis? And I'm thinking about the recent example from Poland, where I come from, where almost 100 towns and regions in the country, almost a third of the country, declared they were so-called LGBT-free zones. And the European Union responded by withdrawing funding from some of those municipalities. So could activists use that kind of support, such as EU support, without falling into the trap of homocapitalism? I was just curious about your thoughts on this very briefly, and then after that, we'll move to the chat. Thank you.
That's such a great question. And I suppose it goes back to what I was thinking about, the resistant possibilities of counter-capitalism, whether that is really a resistance, the fantasy of autonomous capitalism, when in fact capitalism is inherently a global formation. It knows no boundaries, and it cannot know boundaries because it has to constantly expand. But I suppose one of these fantasies, I think, is the fantasy of the power of the pink rupee or the pink dollar or the pink pound. I mean, this is the kind of fantasy that an autonomous capitalism, an autonomous market for an autonomous set of consumers will provide the space for a kind of citizenship, really a consumer citizenship, that the state and the family and the church have not given us. I think that's a very old fantasy that has undergirded a lot of this, seductive promise of homocapitalism. And I shouldn't use the word still as a theorist of time and temporality, but I think I can see that in these formations of homocapitalism that I'm observing emerge, and I feel like that is where the seduction lies, in the belief or the hope or the fantasy, which is what I keep coming back to, that we will find in those spaces a kind of acceptance that we have not found elsewhere, and also be able to express a kind of citizenship that we have been denied elsewhere.
Thank you. And without much ado, I will move to another question from the chat, and as we just have a few minutes. Anish Gawande, would you like to ask your question yourself?
Yes.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Go ahead. I'm just going to read it out because I think I have written it and I don't want to miss a lot from what I've written, but thank you so much for an incredible talk. This has been very, very, it's provided a lot of starting points. And I think, Rahul, your book that's come out recently has been instructive in a lot of the work I'm doing. I'm currently a master's student at Oxford studying intellectual history and working on Indian homo-nationalist discourse in Kashmir. I think, thank you for an insightful question and a talk, sorry. I wanted to tease out the distinction between homo-nationalism and homocapitalism on the lines of seduction and temporality. I think on the question seduction, I wonder how the Islamophobia implicit in Hindu or Brahminical homo-nationalism is also integral in making such a homo-nationalism seductive, not just to Savarnas, but to queers across marginalization. And so in the aesthetics of homo-nationalism, how can we see seduction as an incredibly powerful tool in ensuring its sort of acceptance and its proliferation? And especially in a country like India, where, for instance, Dalit activist groups or queer activist groups can't raise the issue of Kashmiri autonomy as a solidarity question, because that is a hotly contested one and will immediately involve the wrath of the state. I'm thinking to Free Kashmir placards raised at Pride that led to sedition cases. I'm thinking of the sort of slogans for Sharjeel Usmani that were raised that led to sedition cases against a trans person at Mumbai Pride, and other such instances that sort of rupture solidarities. And at the same time, I think I want to build upon Jasbir's distinction of discipline as a way to think through these things, because it is through discipline that the sort of illusion of seduction is created, that being a part of this nationalist rhetoric will allow you full citizenship at a time when citizenship itself is so contested. So there is the queers need to be part of the nationalist project, or else they will be left out of the citizenship project. And so how is seduction implicit in homo-nationalism? And then on the question of temporality, I wanted to push further on the ways in which we can push homo-nationalism and homo-capitalism to their limits. And so how do we demonstrate as activists and academics the ways in which these two are incompatible, a distinction that you raised to sort of destabilize the happy marriage between the two? Because we've seen even in India, the Modi project's biggest success has been marrying capitalism and nationalism, in saying that in that teleological framework where the liberal Hindu wants to become part of the developed world, the solution to the developed world is not progress, but rather within it is a larger implicit idea that the way to go further is by unlearning the violence of British colonialism and Islamic sort of rule. So the way India goes further, even in a capitalist construction, is by taking away these foreign influences and going back to sort of Sunehra Bharat, Golden Past, Sone Ki Chidiya. Sorry, it's a long question on both ends, but thank you so much for your talk again.
Thanks, Anish. I'm not sure if I can answer all of that, but I also hope Jasbir will come in on some of these things, because I think some of these are questions that I'd be curious to hear what you think about. So I thought your question about, and I'm just scrolling up to get to that point, the thing that I was really intrigued by was you say, I wonder how the Islamophobia implicit in Hindu Brahminical homo-nationalism is also integral in making such a homo-nationalism seductive, not just to Savarnas, but to queers across marginalizations. That is very interesting to me. And this points us specifically to the ways in which the BJP has tried to co-opt subordinate caste formations into its Hindu coalition, right? This is precisely where I find Du Bois's idea of the public and psychological wage that was given to poor white labor in the US South so interesting, because that I see as a form of seduction. It's a form of seduction that relies not on material redistribution, but on what he calls the public and psychological boost that is given to white labor that sutures them affectively, not materially, but affectively to the rich white planter class and obviates the formation of a working class movement. This is something that Marx had thought about earlier in the context of English and Irish workers. And it's also something that Ambedkar thinks about when he's asking the question, why is the working class revolution not going to happen? Because caste is a division of laborers, it's a gradation of laborers. All three theorists, I think, are thinking about the affective seductions of these wages of whiteness or wages of Hindutva, whatever you want to call them. And I think that's an incredibly useful concept that to me seems quite mobile across these different contexts. You also asked about discipline, and this goes to Jasbir. One of your questions, I think, was about disciplining. Is this a modality of power running across homonationalism and homocapitalism? And I think it is, but I think we would then need to unpack it. And so I still wonder if there is a higher degree of sovereign power in homonationalism and a higher degree of biopower in homocapitalism. And I'm not sure about this, but I think maybe I would think of disciplining as working across both, but as resting on a slightly different balance of logics. And I'm a bit hesitant to go further down that path because I know that your third book is actually about the slow life of carceral logics. So one of the thoughts I had or wondered about was whether homonationalism relied on a kind of spectacular temporalization more than homocapitalism did. I wondered if homocapitalism was slower, more durational. And maybe this gives us different ways of thinking about disciplining. But I'm not sure. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those possibilities.
I have a lot of thoughts all over the place. So do we want to continue with audience questions?
I think it would be good if you could give some of the thoughts. And then we can probably just take one more question. Given the time, we're a bit over, but I think we can go for another 10 minutes or so. We passed the time we have been allocated.
Well, just maybe one point that I could make, Rahul, you had talked about, Sikhism as kind of the part of, the fold of Hinduism, and how Sikhism has been concretized in these protests as a kind of anti-Hindutva, but they have been also, as you mentioned, with other groups, folded into the BJP project, right? And so. And this line that you wrote, we must be alert to and exploit the possibility that the electoral coalition forged on the back of one set of commitments might splinter in its encounter with the other. So I think that that's, also part of what's happening. That the passage through Islamophobia, it did work as a seduction in the post 9/11 period, continues to work as a form of seduction into the nation state. So the rethinking of homonationalism as driven or also subtending a kind of seduction makes sense to me as well.
Marcin, do you want to take one more question from the chat?
Yes, thank you very much. There is one question that Jasbir wanted to ask, and Jasbir is saying that they can ask the question in person. So Jasbir, could you? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Jasbir, in your latest book, The Right to Maim, you cite crip nationalism as a new a kind of nationalism. And I was just wondering if you would see a similar foil of crip capitalism emerging that could have supplementary but yet distinctly separate logics from crip nationalism? Or do you see crip nationalism as always already about capitalism because it strives to include the disabled subject in capitalist markets?
That's a really great question, and I think to answer just the last part of that question, yes, I do see crip nationalism always driven by access to capital or capitalist forms of privilege. One of the things that I was thinking about in terms of how homonationalism and homocapitalism are both splitting around the question of productivity and productive queers, right? And so that formation, in the same vein as the cost of homophobia that gets calculated in these international instruments of metricization, right? The cost of and the gains of incorporation. There's similar kinds of metrics for disability and for health. We hear about this a lot of the time. So what's really clear is, two things. One is the convergence of homocapitalism and what has been called able nationalism, right? Like there's other registers of productivity that have to contribute to this kind of splitting off of the productive queer and the non-productive queer. So that's one thing. The other thing is still, with the question of homonationalism, like what forms of difference are recuperable and what forms of difference are just unredeemable. I still think that's an important question, and it gets to like why queers at this particular moment and why disability in the early 90s, right? And again, the failures of that those efforts to incorporate, and when is the objection so severe that there's no possibility, there's no redemption, or there's no possibility of a kind of incorporation? I do think that the questions around disability, productivity, health, capacity, debility brings to fore all of those questions, in particular because, per Marx and Marxist theory, the laborer is always set up for debilitation and easily replaced, right?
Thank you, Jasbir. That's very helpful. Marcin, do you want to add any further questions yourself, or Hakan at this stage?
Anything else that Rahul, you think you would like to address at this stage from the rich comments that Jasbir has given?
Yeah, I was really intrigued by everything you said about Sikhi, Jasbir. And I mean, this is not something I know that much about, and it's something I'm still learning. And I was particularly, I was, found particularly thought-provoking the way in which these critiques are emerging that are in solidarity with the protest, but are not idealizing them, and that are alert to these, these troubling contradictions within the protest formation itself. Which I thought was really interesting. What it also made me think about is Ambedkar's relationship with Buddhism, which I know a little bit more about, which is not a kind of appropriation of an unreconstructed Buddhism that is timeless, etc. It's actually a really interesting reinvention of Buddhism. Some people have read it as reading Buddhism as a kind of proto-Marxism, even though he's not a Marxist. So there's a really interesting coming together of different ideas and an active refashioning, which is why it's sometimes referred to as Ambedkarite Neo-Buddhism, which is going on there. And perhaps that is what we see in moments like these protests, right? So it's not a kind of unreconstructed Sikhi or leftist ideology. Something is changing when these formations come together and collide with each other. And this is part of why I think that quote about nothing will ever be the same, precisely because of what's happening in this fluid moment, is so powerful, and I think makes this a space that we really need to watch and to think with, and hopefully to grow with.
Well, I can't think of two more action-packed ways to start our conference this week than these two talks, which have covered an incredible amount of ground and really tell us a lot about where we are around questions of nationalism, coloniality, and the body politic, as well as, of course, queer and questions of capital. So I think we probably need to wind this up. I know people may have appointments, and I'm not actually sure how long our Zoom session is scheduled to last. But I really want to thank both of you, Rahul and Jasbir, for these incredibly erudite and thoughtful introductions, and also for the quality of your dialogue together, which is a really special thing to see. A very special thing to see the two of you in dialogue about such an important and in many ways such an elusive topic, such a global set of questions, and yet about such an intimate set of issues around identity. So yeah, please join me, everyone, in thanking our speakers and also our two wonderful organizers for having put this conference together and made such a brilliant choice of how to start it. Thank you very much.